A security guard is doing his rounds through King's Domain on the afternoon of February 13, 2005, when he notices something wrong. A car has been sitting untouched near the Shrine of Remembrance for what looks like days, parked just off Dallas Brooks Drive, in the shadow of one of Melbourne's most visited war memorials, a few hundred meters from Victoria Police's own headquarters on St. Kilda Road. He calls it in. When police pop the boot, they find a woman, barely alive, locked inside the trunk of her own car, in a state investigators would later describe as consistent with days of confinement. Dehydrated, unresponsive, her brain starved of oxygen. Her name is Maria Korp, 50 years old, a wife, a mother of two, and for the last 4 days, she has been the subject of a missing persons report that her own husband never filed. Paramedics rush her to Alfred Hospital. She is placed in a medically induced coma. Doctors are not yet willing to say whether she'll wake up. 3 days later, police charge 2 people with her attempted murder. Her husband, Joe Korp, and his mistress. To everyone who knew him, Joe Korp was the picture of a devoted husband. Steady job. A family home in Mickleham. No one who crossed paths with him socially had any reason to suspect what police now believe he had planned. But 6 months from this moment, Maria Korp will be dead. Her husband will be gone too, by his own hand on the day of her funeral. And the woman who put her in that boot will tell police a story so strange that even the detectives who'd seen everything struggled to believe it. A story of online dating, secret text messages, and psychics paid tens of thousands of dollars to change a woman's fate. This is the case that started with a car parked too long near a war memorial, and ended with 3 people connected to one house in Mickleham, and only one of them left standing. To understand why Maria Korp's death became one of the most talked about cases in Australian criminal history, you have to understand who she was before any of it happened, because almost nothing about her life looked like the ending it got. She was born Maria Matilda on January 14, 1955, in Portugal. Like so many migrants of her generation, she left everything familiar behind and rebuilt a life in Australia, eventually settling in Melbourne. By the time she reached her 30s, she had a daughter from an earlier marriage. A detail that matters, because it means Maria had already survived one difficult chapter of her life before she ever met the man who would define the rest of it. That man was Joe Korp. When Maria and Joe married in 1991, it wasn't a simple beginning. Maria had, in the years prior, gone out of her way to seek forgiveness repeatedly and directly from Joe's first wife, Leonie Korp, and from Leonie's extended family, for her role in the breakup of that earlier marriage. She told people she believed she'd already received forgiveness from God for it. Whether or not the people around her agreed, it's clear the guilt stayed with her for years. A couple of years into the marriage, Maria and Joe had a son together. By 2005, she was the mother of 2. A grown daughter from her first marriage, and an 11-year-old boy with Joe. The family lived in Mickleham, on Melbourne's northern outskirts, in what was described as a comfortable, financially secure home. From the outside, it looked like exactly the life Maria had been working toward. But underneath that stability, something had been eating at her for at least a year before she disappeared. In 2004, Maria confided in her daughter that she believed Joe was having an affair. It wasn't a vague suspicion. She said he'd started taking more care with his appearance, that he was disappearing for long, unexplained stretches, and that his behavior toward her had shifted in ways she couldn't ignore. Eventually, she found what she believed was proof. Messages on the family computer, and blonde hairs in the seat of his car that weren't hers. What she did with that suspicion is one of the more haunting details to survive her case. Maria would trace small crosses in the dust that had gathered on Joe's car, over and over, in what she described as an attempt to change destiny. It's a small, almost private gesture, the kind of thing a person does when they suspect something is deeply wrong but don't yet have the words, or the will to confront it directly. She also turned to something more costly. Over roughly 3 years, Maria reportedly paid close to $150,000 in cash to 2 psychics. One of them a man named Michael Foshios, whose stated role was to pray for her, light candles, and try to restore good luck, peace, and harmony to her marriage and her life. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost unbelievable next to what was coming. A woman spending a small fortune trying to spiritually will her marriage back into safety, while the actual threat to her life was being built somewhere much closer to home. By early 2005, Maria Korp had spent months sensing that something in her marriage had gone wrong. What she didn't know, what nobody around her seemed to know, was how far that wrongness had already traveled, or who else had quietly become part of it. If you'd asked anyone in Joe Korp's orbit, co-workers, friends, extended family, to describe him in early 2005, dangerous would not have been the word. He held down steady work, kept up a family home in Mickleham, and had, by most outward appearances, settled into the second marriage of his life. That's what made what came next so hard for the people around him to process. Because Joe Korp was already living a second life, and Maria's suspicions from the year before turned out to be right. Sometime in 2004, Joe had begun communicating online with a woman named Tanya Herman. What started as messages grew into an affair, one that, according to what Maria later told her daughter, was accompanied by changes in Joe's own behavior. He started paying more attention to his appearance. He was gone from the house for longer stretches, with explanations that didn't quite add up. Maria found the blonde hairs. She found the messages. She didn't have to imagine the affair was happening. She had evidence of it, sitting in her own home. There was another detail that would only surface after Maria was already fighting for her life. According to a formal missing persons report later filed with Victoria Police, Maria had, at some point, been pressured by Joe to change the contents of her will. It's a small administrative fact on its own. In the context of everything that followed, it reads very differently. A quiet, procedural step taken before anything violent ever happened. Then came February 9, 2005, the day everything changed. Joe told police he last saw Maria at their Mickleham home at around 6:30 a.m. that morning. Maria never showed up to work. She never picked up her 11-year-old son from school. Her car was gone from the house. One detail from that morning would later stand out sharply to investigators. Maria's stepdaughter told police she'd been woken around 6:30 a.m. by the sound of screaming. When she asked Joe about it, he told her she must have been dreaming. By that evening, Joe had called his brother, Gus Korp. According to the account Gus later gave police, Joe told him, "Gus, I think I'm fucked." Gus also told officers that he sometimes helped Joe with his computer, and that in doing so, he'd come across emails Joe had sent to his girlfriend, a woman named Tanya Herman, who lived in nearby Greenvale. He mentioned the suspicious, recent death of Herman's ex-husband. And he told police something no one wants to say about their own brother, that he was concerned Joe may have done something to Maria. It was Gus, not Joe, who walked into a police station that night and reported his sister-in-law missing. That single fact would end up quietly rewriting the entire case before it even properly began. The husband, who by his own account had been the last person to see his wife alive, wasn't the one who raised the alarm. His brother was. By the time police started piecing together what had happened to Maria Korp, one name kept surfacing alongside Joe's: Tanya Herman. She lived in Greenvale, a suburb not far from the Korp's home in Mickleham. According to the missing persons report Gus Korp helped file with police, it was in emails on the family computer that Joe's relationship with her first became visible to people outside the affair itself. Messages between Joe and a woman his own brother didn't recognize as anything more than his girlfriend. The relationship had begun roughly a year earlier, in 2004, reportedly starting online, one of the earlier instances of an internet-facilitated affair becoming central to a major Australian homicide investigation. Back when meeting someone online was still unusual enough to be treated as noteworthy by the press covering the case. There was another thread investigators found impossible to ignore. Gus Korp told police that Herman's ex-husband had died recently, and that the circumstances struck him as suspicious enough to mention by name when he reported his concerns about Maria. It wasn't proof of anything on its own, but it was the kind of detail that made detectives look twice. What's clear from the public record is this. By early 2005, Joe Korp was maintaining two completely separate lives that were about to collide. In Mickleham, he was a husband and father, still living under the same roof as the wife who had spent months trying to save their marriage, with prayers, with psychics, with quiet rituals traced in the dust of his car. In Greenvale, he had built a second relationship that Maria had already suspected, already found evidence of, and had not yet confronted him over in any way that changed his behavior. Neither woman, as far as the record shows, fully understood at this point what role she was about to be assigned in the other story. Maria didn't know how far things had already gone. And whatever Tanya Herman believed about her place in Joe Korp's life, court proceedings would later reveal it was built on information Joe had shaped and withheld, a dynamic that would become one of the most contested parts of the entire case once both of them were in custody. What happened next, in the early hours of February 9, 2005, would turn a private affair into a criminal investigation, and would eventually raise a question the courts themselves would have to sit with. Which of the two people charged that week was the architect of what happened to Maria Korp, and which one had been drawn into something far larger than she understood? Every case like this has one moment where the ordinary becomes irreversible. For Maria Korp, that moment came in her own home, on a Wednesday morning, while most of her neighbors were still getting their kids ready for school. According to what was later established through the police investigation and court proceedings, Joe Korp drove Tanya Herman to the Michelham home he shared with Maria and their children that morning. Herman, according to the case against her, hid inside the garage waiting. At around 6:30 a.m., Maria's stepdaughter woke to the sound of screaming. When she asked Joe about it afterward, he told her she must have been dreaming. She wasn't. Inside that house, according to the evidence that would later be presented in court, Maria was attacked, strangled with a strap until she lost consciousness. She was then placed in the boot of her own car. Joe told police a simpler version of that morning, that he'd last seen his wife at approximately 6:30 a.m., and that nothing seemed out of the ordinary when he left. Maria didn't go to work that day. She didn't pick up her 11-year-old son from school. Her car, the one she'd normally be driving to both, was gone from the house. What makes this part of the case so unsettling isn't complexity. It's how quiet it was. There was no break-in, no struggle visible to neighbors, no reason for anyone nearby to think anything was wrong. A stepdaughter's half-asleep memory of screaming was the only crack in an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning, and even that was explained away in the moment, dismissed as a bad dream by the one person in the house who knew exactly what had happened. By the time the school day ended and Maria hadn't shown up to collect her son, the outline of the morning had already been set. What remained unknown to Maria's family, to police, and for a while even to Tanya Herman herself, according to what she would later tell investigators, was where Maria actually was, and whether she was still alive. At 8:50 p.m. on February 9, 2005, roughly 14 hours after Maria Korp was last seen alive, a phone call came into Victoria Police. It wasn't from Joe Korp. It was from his brother. Gus Korp told the officer who took the call that he was concerned his brother may have done something to Maria. It's an extraordinary thing for anyone to say about a sibling, and Gus didn't say it lightly. He laid out, point by point, everything that had been building toward that moment. He told police that Joe's stepdaughter had described being woken around 6:30 that morning by screaming, and that when she'd asked Joe about it, he'd brushed it off, told her she must have been dreaming. He told them that Joe had, at some point, pressured Maria into changing the contents of her will. And he told them something that had happened just hours earlier, over the phone, between the two brothers themselves. Joe had called him and said, "Gus, I think I'm fucked." Gus had a specific reason to take that phone call seriously. He occasionally helped Joe with his computer, the ordinary kind of tech support one brother does for another, and in doing so, he'd come across emails Joe had sent to a woman he didn't recognize as anything more than his girlfriend, Tanya Herman, who lived in nearby Greenvale. Gus also raised something else that had been sitting uneasily with him, that Herman's ex-husband had died recently, and that the circumstances of it struck him as suspicious enough to mention by name to the officer taking his statement. All of it went into the formal missing persons report filed against Maria Korp's name that night, a document built almost entirely from one brother's unease about another, rather than from anything the husband himself had brought forward. That absence is the detail worth sitting with. In most missing person cases, it's the spouse who raises the alarm first, panicked, present, demanding answers. Here, the person with the most direct, obvious reason to be worried about Maria's whereabouts wasn't the one who picked up the phone. It was a brother, working from second-hand suspicion, a half-remembered explanation about a dream, and a phone call that ended with 5 words he couldn't shake. Police now had a name, a timeline, and a growing list of reasons to be concerned. What they didn't have yet was Maria, and for 4 more days no one would. From the night Korp filed that missing persons report, Victoria police were working with an unusually specific set of concerns for what was, on paper, still a routine missing person case. Most disappearances don't come with a brother's phone call laying out a suspected affair, a pressured will, and a half-explained scream. This one did, and it changed how quickly and how seriously investigators moved. Maria's car, the one she would normally have used to get to work and to pick up her son from school, had vanished along with her. For 4 days, neither turned up. No sightings, no contact, no use of her bank cards or phone that would place her anywhere. For a 50-year-old woman with a steady routine, 2 children who depended on her, and no history of simply walking away from her life, that kind of total silence read as exactly what it was: a very bad sign. Behind the scenes, detectives were already doing what the brother's statement had pointed them toward. Looking closely at Joe Korp himself, and at the woman named in those emails, Tanya Herman, out in Greenvale. The picture that had been handed to police on the night of the 9th, an affair, a pressured will change, a scream explained away as a dream, gave investigators a working theory well before they had a body, or even a crime scene to confirm it. What's clear is that police treated Maria's disappearance as suspicious almost from the moment it was reported, and that the investigation was already quietly narrowing toward the 2 people who would be arrested within the week. Not because a stranger had been ruled out through some elaborate search, but because the people closest to Maria had already given police more reason to look inward than outward. For Maria's family, those 4 days would have been unbearable in a different way, the kind of waiting that has no information to fill it, only the growing, unspoken understanding that the longer it goes on, the worse the outcome tends to be. On the 4th day, that waiting ended. Not with a phone call, and not with news that she'd been found safe. On February 13, 2005, 4 days after Maria Korp vanished from her own home, a car that had been sitting untouched near the Shrine of Remembrance finally drew someone's attention. It was parked on Dallas Brooks Drive, in King's Domain, one of Melbourne's most visited stretches of parkland, surrounded on any given day by tourists, joggers, and office workers on lunch breaks, and it was sitting only a few hundred meters from Victoria Police's own headquarters on St. Kilda Road, close enough that, in a different set of circumstances, an officer could have walked past it on foot. When the car was checked and the boot was opened, police found Maria Korp inside. Alive but only barely. She was rushed to Alfred Hospital, one of Melbourne's major trauma centers. What doctors found there told its own grim story about the 4 days she'd spent missing. She had suffered oxygen starvation to the brain, along with head injuries and severe dehydration, the kind of clinical findings that don't come from a single moment of violence, but from an extended period of time locked away with no food, no water, and dwindling air. Medical staff placed her into a medically induced coma in an effort to stabilize her and manage the swelling and damage already done to her brain. She would never fully wake from it. In the weeks that followed, Maria's condition would be described by doctors as a state of post-coma unresponsiveness. Alive, but with no meaningful prospect of recovery, a distinction that would become central to one of the most difficult parts of the case still to come. For investigators, the discovery did 2 things at once. It confirmed the worst fears that had been building since Korp's call 4 days earlier. And it converted what had been, until that point, a missing person investigation with strong circumstantial suspicion into an active attempted murder case, with a location, a timeline, and physical evidence that could now be tested against everything Joe Korp had told police about the morning of February 9th. The location itself would not be lost on anyone following the case. The Shrine of Remembrance is one of Melbourne's most solemn public monuments, a place built to honor the memory of the dead, visited daily by people paying quiet respects. That Maria Korp had spent her final conscious days locked in a car boot within sight of it was the kind of detail no writer would need to invent. It was simply where she was found. 3 days after that discovery, police would move from suspicion to formal charges, against her husband, and against the woman he'd been driving to and from his own family home for the better part of a year. On February 16, 2005, police charged 2 people in connection with what had happened to Maria Korp: her husband, Joe Korp, 47, and his mistress, Tanya Herman, 38. The charges were serious and specific: attempted murder, conspiracy to murder, and intentionally causing serious injury. The following day, both appeared before Melbourne Magistrates' Court. Neither was granted bail at that stage. Both were remanded in custody, held while prosecutors began building the case that would eventually split their two stories apart in ways almost no one following the case anticipated. What made the arrests so striking wasn't just that two people were charged. It was who they were to each other and to Maria. This wasn't a stranger pulled off the street on a tip. This was the victim's own husband, and the woman he'd been secretly involved with for the better part of a year, both facing charges for what had been done to the woman standing between them. According to later accounts of the case, Joe Korp's strategy in the earliest days of the investigation was to direct police attention toward Herman, and away from his own role in what had happened. It's a detail that would come to define how the public understood him in the months that followed. A man willing to let the woman he'd been having an affair with absorb the full weight of what police believed had happened to his wife, while working to keep his own involvement in the shadows. Herman, for her part, did not stay silent for long. Rather than continuing to fight the charges, she made a decision that would ultimately separate her legal fate from Joe's entirely. She went to police and gave a full account of what had happened, one that implicated herself but also laid out, in detail, the role she said Joe had played in planning it. That decision, to confess rather than continue denying, is the hinge point of the entire case. It's what turned two people charged with the same crime into two people whose outcomes would look almost nothing alike by the time the year was over. One of them would face a court, plead guilty, and begin serving a sentence. The other would never see the inside of a courtroom for these charges at all. On June 8, 2005, less than 4 months after Maria Korp was found in the boot of her own car, Tanya Herman stood before the Supreme Court of Victoria and pleaded guilty to attempted murder. It was the moment that permanently separated her fate from Joe Korp's. Herman's guilty plea meant the court didn't need a trial to establish what had happened to Maria. Her own admission became part of the legal record. On July 1, 2005, she was sentenced. 12 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 9 years, meaning she would not be eligible even to be considered for release until she'd served at least 3/4 of that sentence. Notably, when Maria died weeks later, in August, the charge against Herman was never upgraded to murder. Her case had already been finalized under the original charge, a legal technicality that meant the timing of her plea, made while Maria was still alive, locked in the more lenient charge for good. Joe Korp made the opposite choice. He pleaded not guilty to every charge against him: attempted murder, conspiracy to murder, intentionally causing serious injury, and on June 9, 2005, the day after Herman's plea, he was released on bail to await trial. It's worth sitting with how strange that split outcome was. Two people, charged with the same set of crimes against the same woman, standing in the same court system within 24 hours of each other, and walking out with completely different realities. One behind bars, sentenced, her fate settled. The other back in the community, presumed innocent under the law, free to move through the world while the woman he was accused of trying to kill lay unconscious in a hospital bed across the city. Prosecutors weren't finished with Joe Korp, though. A further charge, murder, was expected to be laid against him once Maria's condition reached its inevitable conclusion. It was a charge that existed, at this stage, only as a formality waiting on a medical outcome no one wanted to say out loud. In the meantime, out on bail, Joe did something that struck many people as almost impossible to reconcile with the charges hanging over him. He applied to have his bail conditions modified so that he could visit Maria in the hospital. Victoria's public advocate, Julian Gardner, who had been appointed Maria's legal guardian in April 2005, once her incapacity made her unable to make decisions for herself, approved a supervised visit, with hospital staff and police present throughout. A man accused of trying to murder his wife, sitting at her bedside under police supervision, while the woman who confessed to helping him began serving a 12-year sentence. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too strange for a true story, and yet it's exactly what the court record shows. What neither Joe Korp nor anyone else in that hospital room could have known was that Maria had only weeks left to live, and that the decision about when and how those weeks would end was about to become a national controversy of its own. By the summer of 2005, Maria Korp had been unresponsive for months. She was breathing, her heart was beating, but she had shown no meaningful signs of consciousness since the day she was found in that car boot. The medical team treating her at Alfred Hospital had continued to monitor her closely, hoping for some change. It never came. On July 26, 2005, Julian Gardner announced a decision that would turn her private tragedy into a national debate. Gardner said the artificial nutrition and hydration keeping Maria alive would be withdrawn, that palliative care would take its place, and that she was expected to die within 1 to 2 weeks. Gardner didn't make that call alone or lightly. He and his staff had spent months speaking with people who knew Maria well, including her priest, trying to understand what she herself would have wanted. He also sought the opinion of a Catholic ethicist, given Maria's faith. Every doctor who examined her, including an independent specialist brought in specifically for a second opinion, agreed that further treatment beyond palliative care offered her no realistic hope of recovery. The announcement landed at a strange moment in the world's news cycle. Just months earlier, the case of Terry Schiavo, an American woman kept alive for over a decade in a vegetative state before her feeding tube was removed following years of court battles, had dominated headlines around the world. Maria Korp's case arrived almost as an Australian echo of it, and it was treated that way. Anti-euthanasia campaigners organized protests outside Alfred Hospital, arguing the decision amounted to letting a vulnerable woman starve. Some of Maria's own family members opposed it too, though their specific reasons were never made fully public, beyond a general insistence that the doctors were wrong, and that Maria wasn't as far gone as they were being told. Not everyone in her family felt that way. Her daughter, Laura DeGoys, did not oppose Gardner's decision. An appeal against Gardner's guardianship was reportedly considered by opponents as a way of challenging the decision through the courts. In the end, no appeal was ever filed. On July 27, 2005, the feeding tube was removed, and Maria Korp was moved fully into palliative care. She died at 2 a.m. on Friday, August 5, 2005, 5.5 months after she was found in the boot of her own car near the Shrine of Remembrance, and almost exactly 6 months after the morning she disappeared. Her death did more than end a family's ordeal. It reopened the legal case against Joe Korp in a way everyone had been quietly expecting for weeks. The murder charge prosecutors had said was waiting on a medical outcome was no longer hypothetical. Maria was gone, and the question of what would happen to the man out on bail, the man who had sat at her hospital bedside under police supervision just weeks earlier, was about to be answered in a way nobody expected. Maria Korp's funeral was held about a week after her death. Her family made one thing clear beforehand: Joe Korp would not be welcome there. He was barred from attending the service for the woman he stood accused of trying to kill. He didn't stay quiet about it. Instead, Joe invited media to a private ceremony of his own, held at his home on the same day as Maria's funeral. In front of the cameras, he sang 2 songs, Unchained Melody and The Lady in Red. It was a scene that struck many who covered the case as almost impossible to reconcile with everything that had come before it. A man facing an expected murder charge, performing grief for an audience, on the day the woman's family had explicitly excluded him from saying goodbye to her properly. That night, Joe made 2 phone calls. One to his first wife. One to a newspaper journalist. To both, he said the same thing: that he intended to hang himself in his garage. Both people who received those calls took them seriously enough to contact police immediately. Officers rushed to the house. When they arrived, they found Joe Korp standing on a ladder in his garage, a noose around his neck, still talking on his mobile phone. According to the police account of what happened next, Joe was looking toward the officers through the garage window at the moment the ladder tipped over. Investigators believe he may have been trying to regain his footing when it happened. He died there on August 12, 2005, the same day as Maria's funeral. Around his body, officers found photographs of Maria, football memorabilia, and handwritten notes maintaining his innocence. A coroner's toxicology report later found his blood alcohol level at 0.15, nearly 3 times the legal driving limit in Victoria, at the time of his death. Reports at the time noted he had reportedly been on the phone with his solicitor in his final moments. With Joe Korp dead, the murder charge prosecutors had been preparing against him died with him. No trial, no verdict, no chance for a court to formally weigh the evidence against the one person who was there in that Michelham house on the morning of February 9th. Evidence that only ever reached the public through Tanya Herman's confession, Gust Korp's statement, and the physical facts of what was done to Maria. Herman was the only person ultimately held legally accountable. She served her sentence at the Dame Phyllis Frost Center, Victoria's maximum security women's prison. In January 2013, she applied for permission to marry a fellow inmate, Nicole Muscat. On February 14, 2014, Valentine's Day, she was released on parole, having served a little over 8 years of her 12-year sentence. The case didn't end quietly. In 2006, journalist Carly Crawford, who had covered the story from the beginning and was reportedly one of the last people to speak with Joe Korp before his death, published the Maria Korp case, The Woman in the Boot story. It was adapted into a television film in 2010, Wicked Love, the Maria Korp story, narrated from Maria's own perspective. In 2012, the story inspired an opera, Midnight Sun. And in 2018, it was the subject of an episode of the Case File True Crime podcast, introducing the case to an entirely new generation of listeners 2 decades on. What remains unresolved is the question no court ever got to answer. How much of what happened to Maria Korp was Tanya Herman's doing, and how much was Joe Korp's? A man who spent his final months trying to shift blame onto the woman he'd drawn into his affair, and who, by dying before trial, ensured that question would never be tested in front of a jury. Maria Korp spent years trying to save a marriage she sensed was already lost, with prayers, with psychics, with small crosses traced in the dust of a car. In the end, none of it could change what was already in motion. Her husband looked, to everyone around him, like exactly the kind of man he wasn't.